I'm located. My name is Sharon Tewksbury-Bloom, and I used to be a professional leader of volunteers for over a decade, and now I do a lot of my own independent work, often with organizations that have volunteers, whether that's nonprofits or local governments, AmeriCorps programs especially, since I am an AmeriCorps alum myself, go National Service, and also had run AmeriCorps programs for several years. So I have a very deep love of volunteer engagement. It's how I first got passionate about working in the field of service, and this is the first way that I ever got engaged with some of the concepts we're going to talk about today, like managing people and doing planning and facilitating effective meetings and getting groups together who can actually learn from one another. All of these big concepts are things that you get to learn, are forced to learn by nature of managing volunteers. In fact, I think there's no better way to learn all kinds of leadership and management skills than being thrust into the role of working with volunteers, because it's all the messy and complicated and fascinating parts of working with humans, while also not having some of the traditional levers to pull when it comes to what you read in the textbooks about managing and leading organizations. And we're going to talk about how that applies to planning and long-term planning as well, and why maybe what you know about long-term planning doesn't always prepare you for when you're trying to apply that in an organization that is often powered by volunteer power. All right, I see we have some more people joining us. As we go along, if you didn't get a chance yet, I invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself. We've got people joining from all over Arizona, and some people are joining from other parts of the country as well. So I'm grateful to have you all here and hope that we can dive in and learn a lot from each other. Diving in now, why is this topic critical? Well, this topic is about recognizing and retaining volunteers by engaging them in long-term planning. And one of the words I really want to pull out as a critical word is retaining. Volunteer retention is one of the trickiest things, and one of the things that really causes organizations powered by volunteers a lot of consternation. It's a chronic issue across the board, whether you're a new organization, small, large, government, nonprofit. All of us struggle with how do we retain our volunteer labor force. And I'm sure you know, if you've been in this field for a little while or if you have experience, is that it is a lot cheaper and easier to retain volunteers than to continuously cycle through and recruit new volunteers. So it's always advantageous of us to be looking at those strategies that we can use to try to retain our volunteers, particularly those who align really well with our mission or who bring really valuable skills to our organization. In addition to us wanting to solve this problem around retention, there's also a lot of valuable insights that your organization can gain from those who have taken the time to devote themselves and their passion to your organization. If you're about to go through a planning process, or you just want to always be keeping an eye on the future and doing some long-term planning, who better to involve in that process than those who have chosen to get involved with what you do and have dedicated their volunteer time to you? I think that they have some of the most valuable insights that we could possibly gain. All right, let's dive in and talk about what you might encounter as we go along in here. I'm going to start with a broader concept that applies across the board about volunteer recruitment and retention. How many people here are familiar with Abraham Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you've taken a Psychology 101 course or just familiar from the lingo, you might have heard someone refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or just the concept of a hierarchy of needs. Now, I will point out, because I have a social science background, that the hierarchy aspect of this, the idea that we maybe have more needs at the bottom, less needs at the top, or that some needs are more valuable, That has all not been proven. However, the idea that people, humans, have different types of needs and that they need those different types of needs satisfied in different ways throughout their lives, that is a really helpful model to think about. So if you're not quite familiar with it, I'm going to quickly recap here. The basic idea is that there's the base level needs that we could refer to as physiological needs. Feel free to participate in the chat if you want to throw in your own thoughts as we go along on this. I always love that. Physiological, these are the basics of like food and shelter and water. Anyone who has run a volunteer event, you have encountered this. This is a lot of what goes into event planning. Do people know where the restroom is? Do they have free food? Have you provided food for your volunteers? And the #1 trick in the book, if you're doing volunteer management, is to provide food. That's because physiological needs are our very first needs. If you are hungry, it is hard to concentrate. So we always try to think about that. Going up from that, and I will say I usually have great stories that go along with this in more detail, but this is not actually the focus of the training. I just want to use it as a baseline point to talk about how this applies in planning. So the second type of needs are safety needs. These are both physical safety and psychological safety. As volunteer managers or leaders, we think about that a lot. I have had to do a lot of risk assessments in my day. We deal with background checks. We deal with making sure we've got proper PPE, personal protective equipment. We're doing safety training. We've thought about, emergency evacuation plans, all of this kind of stuff. Safety is always something that we consider when working with humans in general and particularly working with volunteers. But then it starts to really get interesting. Because up from safety, we're talking about belonging. And you might not have thought about it in this way before, but if you just pause and think about who's been involved in your organization for a long time and what keeps them coming back, I would hazard a guess that belonging and their sense of belonging with your organization is part of what retains them, whether they're a staff or a volunteer. And then moving up from that is esteem. Esteem is really talking about people feeling like they're doing work that matters and they're using their skills. They are being able to be capable in what they do and add value. This is something that we talk about quite a bit in volunteer management, of trying to find that right fit so that a volunteer is able to be successful. They are able to really share their strengths with your organization. First of all, because obviously you want to gain that volunteer capital from them of being able to benefit from those skills and experience and abilities that they have, but also because that's a form of volunteer retention. So a lot of times when I'm doing volunteer management training, I focus on the fact that all 4 of these categories are critical when working with volunteers. But these 2 categories play bigger roles in the recruitment process of bringing volunteers on. Volunteers need to feel safe in order to start working with your organization. Volunteers need to feel like you're going to take care of them. They need to feel welcomed. And you can do that a lot of times by focusing on both the physiological and the safety. However, when you're moving forward and a volunteer has been with you a little while and they're starting to show more interest in staying involved with your organization, or you want them to show more interest in staying involved, that's when it switches a bit. And the focus is really on the belonging and the esteem. How can we zero in on these categories to make sure that each volunteer understands how they fit and feels part of the group and understands how they can add value and has the opportunity to add value? And this is where, on both of these, planning, long-term planning processes can play a key role. Because when you engage a volunteer in your planning process, it helps them, first of all, feel like they belong, because you're telling them explicitly that they are part of the future. You want their insights and their contributions to the future planning of your organization. That tells them not only do they belong now, but you have an intention of them belonging in the future. And then also on the esteem side, it tells them that you don't just want them for their physical labor, but you also, if that's what they're providing, but you also want them to share all of their gifts and skills, whatever it is that they have to contribute, particularly their thoughts, their ideas, their valuable insights that they can share with you. And that will build up their understanding that they have the ability to build esteem within their role with your organization. There was actually a study done to look specifically at baby boomers. This was several years ago, and looking at what some of the factors were that would retain baby boomers. And what they found was when you engaged baby boomer volunteers in professional or management activities, particularly including strategic planning, those volunteers had the highest rate of retention at 74.8%, basically 75%. 3 out of 4 baby boomer volunteers who were engaged in these higher order activities, in the idea of this, such as planning, were retained at a greater rate, 3 out of 4. Compared with the lowest rate was when they were only used for general labor. If a volunteer was only volunteering in general labor tasks, they were only retained at a 56% rate. It's a significant difference. So that's just another reason why you might want to consider, even if someone's normally a volunteer in more of a general task role for your organization, if you give them the opportunity sometimes to be involved in some of these other roles, such as planning, that may help with that retention. All right, let me give you another model, mental model to think about. This is the idea that volunteers are motivated by different things and in different ways to come and serve with your organization. By the way, my office is smelling very strongly because I love to use these Mr. Sketch smelly markers, and I like to use color. So I've got all sorts of blue raspberry and blueberry, and I have no idea, but I'm going to try not to pass out from all the wonderful smells that are happening right here. So if we're thinking for a second about what motivates someone to start volunteering or continue volunteering with an organization, there's a few different categories. First would be self. I'm going to say client, or for some people it's easier to think of this as cause. And then the final one would be the organization itself. Let me give you a quick example. Again, this is something I usually go into more depth on in volunteer management training, but I just want to use it to talk about how this results in planning differences. So self could be, maybe they're looking for professional development. So they've gotten involved with your organization to learn something new or to develop their own skills. That also could be someone who is involved with, let's say, another organization, and they encourage them to do volunteer hours. Maybe it's even their work. Their workplace is offering them the chance to volunteer, and they get to leave work and do something interesting. So that might be more of a self-motivation. It also could be just, I've volunteered at a lot of nonprofit events, including things like beer festivals, because I got to volunteer, do something fun, and then I got a free ticket to the event. That was a pretty self-motivated reason for volunteering. One of the very common causes of motivation is the client or the cause. So an everyday example of this would be someone who volunteers in their own child's classroom. You're a classroom volunteer, that's because the client, i.e. your child, is your motivation for doing that volunteer work. That also, though, could be a cause. So for example, maybe you're passionate about the environment, and so you're going to go out to a cleanup day because you really care about beautiful open spaces and public lands and you want to help clean up. So this could be a person or a cause or any of those things. Hopefully that made sense. Let me know if it doesn't. Finally, there's the actual organization. Sometimes people are going to volunteer because they're passionate about your organization. Let me give you an example of this. My sister is a leukemia survivor. She had childhood leukemia, and when she had her bone marrow transplant as a child, she stayed in a Ronald McDonald house, or more like my mother stayed in a Ronald McDonald house, so that they could be close to the hospital while she was having the transplant. My family, and my mother in particular, have remained connected to that specific organization, Ronald McDonald House, throughout our lives. And in fact, my mom volunteers there about once a week. And she does something that I actually was really surprised that she agreed to do, which is usually she's cleaning up at the house. She tidies the kitchen, she organizes food that have been brought in as donations to prepare for the families. My mom doesn't even like cooking. She actually hires, she's maybe going to be mad at me, I think she's maybe on this call, but you know, she's more likely to hire someone to clean her own house, but she's willing to go and volunteer and clean the kitchen at the Ronald McDonald House because she cares so deeply about the value that that organization brings, and she aligns with their mission. So why does this matter in the consideration of engaging volunteers in long-term planning? Why this matters is because the ideal volunteer, the volunteer who is going to stay with your organization and bring the most value and get the most value out of their experience, is someone who makes their way to the middle of this Venn diagram. They feel like they're personally benefiting it. You often hear that from volunteers who say, I feel like I get more than I give. They are passionate about the client or cause that you serve, and they really believe that your organization is well suited and well respected and aligned with their values, and they want to serve at your organization. What I often see happen is that a volunteer comes for one of these two reasons, but they have not been brought on board in alignment with the organization itself. They're not motivated by that particular organization. They may be passionate about the environment, but there's a lot of different organizations that serve the environment. And if something happens where your organization maybe changes its hours and makes it harder to volunteer, or they move to a new part of the city and it's not as convenient, they might just stop volunteering at your organization and pick up volunteering at a different organization who support the same cause. And that's a good scenario. Sometimes it's even more dangerous than that. Sometimes there's actually a volunteer who might go rogue. This happens, for example, sometimes in schools where you've got a parent volunteer who cares deeply about their child, but they may not have been fully on board with all the mission, the plans, the policies of that particular school. And they decide that either they could do it better or they just don't, those rules don't apply to them, and they go rogue and they start doing their own thing. And of course, that creates more risk for the organization. So when you are doing your planning process, this is a beautiful time to take someone who entered your organization from one of these other motivations and educate them about your mission, your vision, your values, where you're going, why your organization has the capacity to serve this client or cause, how they could continue to grow and develop, as how you as an organization can continue to become a stronger advocate for that client or cause, become a stronger organization, and how that volunteer can play a role. Okay, I'm diving through a lot of things. Definitely, if you have questions, let me know as we go along. So hopefully I've made the case for the fact that there's a lot of benefits to the volunteers themselves and to the idea that you can retain volunteers more effectively if you engage them in long-term planning. But let me pull back for a minute and say, okay, so you're doing a strategic plan, let's say, and you're going through a process of looking at your SWOT analysis. I don't know if anyone's been a part of one of these. The SWOT is commonly used to identify your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. And then you might set, for example, I'm going to shorten that here, threats. You might come up with SMART goals. There's all these wonderful acronyms in the traditional planning world and then our facilitation methods. Or you might make sure that your goals are specific and measurable and attainable or aggressive. I've seen both used. Let's say aggressive. And results-oriented and time-bound. My point is, there's lots of well-established tools, techniques, strategies that facilitators like myself, like others, use to help organizations go through something like a strategic planning process. The challenge I have found from being in the volunteer sector is that none of the methods I've been taught are working off of the assumption that a majority of your labor force is volunteer. And for some of you, that might not be the case. You might engage volunteers, but they're not the majority of your labor force. But I think in particular for those organizations where the bulk of how work gets done in your organization and how your mission is accomplished is through voluntary labor, that really is a huge change to thinking about how you're going to get your goals accomplished, and frankly, what goals are the greatest priority and how you want to move forward in long-term planning. So if you just go through a traditional planning process and either don't engage your volunteers or don't really think critically about how the design of your planning process itself takes into account the fact that your labor force is voluntary, I believe you won't get the results you're looking for. Another term that you might be familiar with, depending on what field you're in, is ABCD. We love acronyms. ABCD stands for Asset-Based Community Development. I'm just going to write asset because that's the word that often is hardest for me to say clearly so that people understand. You can probably find out the rest. Asset-Based Community Development. This is an example of a planning method and an idea generation method that started from a completely different framework and assumption. It started with, let's throw out all of our normal way to analyze profit and loss and traditional metrics and all of that. Throw that all out because we're doing community development work and we want to start with where our strengths are, which is starting by recognizing that actually our community is full of assets that we can draw upon as we do our work. So let me give you a great example. I am working a lot as a volunteer with a local theater company, Theatricos Theater, and I love the approach that they're taking as they look at some of these new strategies. They want to bring in more revenue, they want to stabilize their revenue sources, but they started thinking creatively about what are the other assets and potential partnerships that are available that might be able to help us grow new revenue sources. One thing that they found out was that there was a real motivation to draw in visitors to our city during months where visitation is traditionally low. Here in Flagstaff, Arizona, we have a great outdoor community. People come here to go skiing, to go hiking, to do all sorts of beautiful things, to see the Grand Canyon. But there are months when it rains more or it's 40 degrees and a little bit gray out, and those traditionally have been hard to bring people in. So there was this wonderful understanding that the arts, the indoor arts, things where you can go into a theater and watch an amazing show, could be the vehicle to solve multiple problems and to develop new assets in our community from the existing assets. We have an amazing visitor center. We have an amazing Convention and Visitors Bureau. Lots of resources are already putting into drawing in more tourists. And all we needed to do was create the right opportunity at the theater that would align with what those tourist populations were looking for. And that would allow the theater to bring in a new source of revenue, which would help stabilize our consistent revenue sources so that we could offer more of those seasonal community programs that we love so much. And it would also benefit the tax revenue in the city. So sometimes my main point here is that if you just go and look in a textbook or look in online for how do I do strategic planning, or how do we do action planning, how do we assess our strengths and weaknesses, most of the models you're going to find, these traditional frameworks, are built on the assumption that you have different levers to pull than you actually do, that you could hire more people, even on the traditional profit-driven model. So if you are a nonprofit or a government, if you increase services, or even if you just improve your services, which seems like a no-brainer and it would be fantastic, you may end up with unintended consequences. For example, if you run a tutoring program and you're able to offer such amazing tutoring services that you start drawing in more and more clients, young students who need your services, well, that's going to put more pressure on your existing resources and on your capacity. And it's not necessarily going to bring in any additional capacity or resources, because those clients, in this case, students, unless you have a fee for service model, they are just coming in for services. They're not also bringing a revenue source. So I just want to bring that up, because I think that as we see the motivation for diving into long-term planning processes and the benefits it can bring, I do want to add that cautionary note that I want you to be very cautious and intentional about what type of planning processes you take on. Okay, I'm going to go back for a minute. Now that I've cautioned you about that, let's talk a little bit more about volunteer retention and how this continues to, some strategies for volunteer retention, how that might play in with the planning processes you might want to take on. So I'm going to do my best approximation of a ladder. If you haven't thought like this before, I'd encourage you with your group to think about your volunteer program, the way you engage the public even. This is also sometimes used by people looking at ways to engage donors as a ladder of engagement. I remember when I was first starting out in volunteer recruitment, and I was passionate. I loved what we did. I really wanted to get new volunteers into our program. And I came across really strong when I would meet someone who was a potential candidate to volunteer at our organization. I was just like, oh, I'm so excited to meet you. I'm really glad that you might want to do this. Here's what we do. Here's all of the reasons why we're amazing. This is what we can do to get you on board. In fact, as soon as you come in the door, we're going to just give you all this paperwork to fill out. But as soon as you've done that, we're going to give you a shirt and a pin and the keys to our office, and we're going to tell you everything that we've ever done. And then we're going to tell you that our life depends on you continuing to volunteer here, because we really, really need you. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but really not much. A lot of times particularly if you're feeling a bit desperate to recruit more volunteers, you come across really strong, really intense. And it's hard not to, particularly if you feel like your situation is urgent. But when you get a chance to breathe, think about a longer term strategy. Think about volunteers not as a short-term solution to an urgent problem, but as a long-term relationship. Even if someone doesn't volunteer in a traditional way for a really long time, if you are treating that relationship like a long-term relationship, they may still always stay on board as an advocate for your organization. So an easy model would be maybe someone has moved. They physically cannot volunteer for you anymore, and you've invested a lot in that relationship. Well, if you've done this well, and if they are a good fit for your organization, they may still promote what you do, educate other people about your organization, maybe even help you recruit new volunteers from people that they still know who are living in that same city. So if you think about this as a long-term relationship, think about other relationships in your life. Maybe dating, for example. When you first meet someone, you do not give them the keys to your house the first time you meet them. It's like dating safety 101. You start off small, and hopefully you start off reciprocal. You share a little bit about yourself, they share a little bit about themselves. Imagine going on a date, and there's certainly plenty of movies out there in which this happens if you can't imagine it for yourself, in which the one person is just sitting there while the other person has an ongoing 2-hour monologue about themselves. They're probably not going to get a follow-up date. So start small, and reciprocal. Don't have someone come on board on their very first time volunteering for you, diving in the deep end where they're taking on the most difficult role in your organization or the biggest time commitment role in your organization. That is an easy path to burn out and to lose people. So think about how you can do that. But then you also don't want to keep people small. That's the same way if you had a relationship with someone and all you ever did was just keep it at the surface level. Talk about the weather, talk about your cat. You never got any deeper, never let them ever come over to your house, or even maybe you just kept it as an online conversation, you never got to meet them. You probably wouldn't feel all that invested in the relationship. So that's where you start to, get to know one another more. On your side, you may start to educate them more about your organization, give them the opportunity to learn a little bit more, maybe come to an open house, get a chance to review some of the important milestones in your organization's history. You also, though, want to know about them. So you're getting to know more about their strengths and weaknesses. You're taking someone out to coffee and just getting to know how their experience has been so far. What else is interesting to them? What other skills are they hoping to develop? So then maybe they've moved up to the point where they're doing something that engages their skills a little bit more. And this could be a good time as you move up to ask them questions about their ideas. Maybe not go deep and engage them fully in a 2-day planning process, but certainly getting their insights, whether that's as simple as doing a survey and asking them their opinion. Surveys are okay. I would say when possible, being able to actually just call someone up. Say, hey, we're working on planning for this. I just wanted to ask you 5 quick questions about your experience so far so that we can have a little bit more insight as we move forward in changing this program. So just basic. But then, again, if you never advance, they might not feel like you really trust them, like they really belong, like they have that sense of esteem. That's where we go back to the beginning with the belonging and esteem. So as you keep going up this ladder, you look for those opportunities to engage them more in a leadership way. Now, leadership means different things to different people. So that's not necessarily a title. They're not necessarily going to join the board. But leadership could look like they help to orient a new volunteer. You bring them on in an informal or formal way as a mentor. Or it might mean that you ask them to get more involved in helping you with the planning piece of this. And then really, the idea as you move up the ladder is that they are gaining more independence and the ability to act on behalf of your organization. That's what a lot of board members do. That's what a lot of long-term, well-trusted, well-educated about your organization volunteers do. And that's when they're extremely valuable, is when you're not always having to check in with this person. You know that they could represent your organization. Maybe they go and give a speech on behalf of what you do. They could also go and ask for money if they're on the fundraising side. You know, these are these things where they're actually making, taking actions on behalf of you without you needing to be there or without you needing to be as involved. And this is all part of a progression. But the key is that it is a progression. And if you bring someone on their very first day and you have them thrown in right at the top, first of all, it's risky. That's when we sometimes have really dangerous things happen in nonprofits, where someone is given a high trust position before they've built any trust, and it turns out they weren't worthy of that trust. They could have embezzled money from the organization. You don't know it. So there are serious risk concerns, which is a reason why this works well. There's also just great relationship building and how you can help someone not burn out, help someone feel valued, recognize them as, hey, you are really someone that we trust here. We're giving you this additional responsibility, or we're asking for your insights. One thing I find people are surprised about a lot is they say, you know, our volunteers are really busy. We don't want to bother them by giving them a call and asking them a few questions about the program. That just feels like we would be bothering them when they're already giving so much. And I get that concern. However, that's never been my experience. When I have helped organizations and I've maybe made calls on their behalf to ask for these insights from the volunteers, often I get the response, "It is such an honor to even be asked." Maybe that's counterintuitive to you, but I'm telling you that that is how I have seen it actually happen. People don't feel burdened when it is done thoughtfully and when this progression is not just throwing them in the deep end, but is a steady development of their role within your organization. One other point I want to make about this specifically, and I see I have some folks on here from Area Agency on Aging. I welcome any other insights on this. One of my very first roles in the world of volunteerism was working with senior services. And I worked with a lot of amazing active seniors who were very involved in their community and volunteered extensively. And I was also a volunteer at a history museum where the majority of our volunteers were retired. Many of them were in their late 60s, 70s, some in their 80s. And in particular, I noticed this at the History Museum because our primary volunteer need there was to give tours of a historic house. The challenge with that is that the house had stairs. And multiple times over the decade that I volunteered there, we would have volunteers either just with natural arthritis and pains that they were facing as they aged, or maybe someone just had a skiing accident and broke their leg. There were lots of times when volunteers had a physical disability, temporary or otherwise, that prevented them from continuing to do the volunteer role that they had done for sometimes decades. And if you've done your work well previously, and like we said, the belonging and the esteem is really there, volunteers oftentimes have a strong sense of identity tied up in these long-term volunteer roles that they have served. So if they are no longer physically able to do that which they have done for your organization for decades, it can be very difficult, and I mean, it's frankly heartbreaking. So this is why a lot of organizations are thinking about the idea, I've sometimes heard it called an emeritus role, bringing from the academic side. Something that keeps someone engaged, who's given years of their time to your organization, is still passionate about what you do, but for whatever reason, they're physically or geographically unable to stay involved in the same way. And maybe they take on a role up here where they're involved intellectually. They're involved as an advisor or a mentor or an ambassador. They have some other role that allows them to still contribute and still have that sense of belonging, because you keep them on the volunteer roles, you continue to update them on the volunteer program, on the progress in your organization, and they don't have to feel any sadness or shame of having been taken out of such an important role that they've held for so long. All right, I know that we are getting close to the end here. I do welcome, as I've welcomed throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, I would love to hear them. As you're putting any questions you might have or thoughts, how does anything I've said today apply to what you're doing? I would love to hear if you gained an insight or you have maybe a note you wrote down to yourself of something that you want to do based on anything that I've said today. I would really appreciate you sharing that. I see I've got one, so I'm going to read it real quick. I see there's a thing about Vistas who are working within schools. Absolutely. So if you're on the webinar, I encourage you to read the comment. I think this was from Tanya. Yep, Tanya's comment. And I think that this is an important one because many of you are in this situation where maybe you host a volunteer program, whether that's national service or community volunteers or RSVP, and then you are helping to place those volunteers in other organizations. And you don't have a whole lot of control over how those organizations are run, maybe what that work culture is like, and that can be difficult. I think that that's maybe a time when, bring us back here for a second. That may be a time when you, as the convener of these volunteers, need to double up on this idea of belonging in particular. I know I was in this situation. I would recruit volunteers for an AmeriCorps program, and we would orient the volunteers, we'd provide them with training when they first came on board, and then we would place them at all these different nonprofits throughout the county. And in many cases, that person that we had recruited, serving as an AmeriCorps member, they might be the only person from our program at that school or nonprofit. And although they felt that sense of belonging initially, when we brought them on board, that could quickly dissipate. Now, some of the volunteers replaced the belonging that we had given them by really diving into the culture of that site that they were at. And they were well welcomed, they were accepted, they felt a strong sense of belonging, actually to the point where it almost became a problem because they forgot that they were there because of our program. So for either reason, either because you want them to remember that they're still part of your program, or because you're not sure that they're going to get that experience at the site that they're at, that's when it helps to really be creative about other ways that you can give them that sense of connection and belonging. So one way that might be I used to, on a casual level, coffee with the coordinator. Now this sounds like not a big, like how would that foster the sense of belonging? But I think that belonging often comes from knowing that there's a human out there who has your back, and that they're thinking about you. So I used to try to do things like required monthly calls. And they have their place, but I will say when you're required to be on a monthly call and you may or may not contribute, that might help you get some information that's important for you to do your job, but I don't think it fosters a sense of belonging. It's really hard to give that full sense of belonging on something that feels as sterile as a required monthly call. If, on the other hand, even if they can't always attend, if you offer up something that's a bit more relational, like come have coffee when you can, even if they're not there, I've had people give me the feedback of saying, I thought it was so thoughtful that you opened that up to us. Or even things like checking in with them on key milestones in their work, remembering their birthday, doing other things that might be small gestures but help keep them connected. Because one thing I do want to say is that the work doesn't need to be easy. So sometimes when I was trained as a volunteer manager, I got so focused on the physiological and the safety needs of my volunteers that I sometimes thought that I needed to pave the way for them and make sure that it was easy, that they weren't going to struggle, they were always going to have everything they needed, the volunteer work was always going to feel meaningful, it was going to be a positive experience where everyone was nice to them and nothing bad ever happened. And I realized over time that that wasn't necessary, it wasn't what people were expecting, and it wasn't always the best thing. Sometimes, depending on the role you've been asked to play, and for something like Vista, they've willingly and knowingly taken on a role of leadership that is going to be hard. And so sometimes I would switch that and just make sure I was setting realistic expectations. And to know that they always had that human connection and that support from me and from others in the program, but I didn't make it easy because it wasn't easy. So much of the work that we're doing, so much of the work that all of you are doing, it's not easy. And I'm reminded of that quote from, I think, John F. Kennedy about, President Kennedy, about we do it not because it's easy, but because it is hard. That's why a lot of people get involved, why they contribute in these deep and meaningful ways. So we don't want to take out the hard part, unless the hard part is just annoying paperwork that we should try to make simpler. But we do want to make sure that this person is always given those opportunities to feel supported, to feel like we value them, not just for their time, but also for all of them, their ideas, their passion, their connection, all of those things. Hopefully that helped. Be curious to see if that resonated or just made things murkier for anyone. Yeah, I love that Danielle says she wrote the idea down about senior ambassadors for the program. Absolutely, and I think if you have a program that's been around for more than, let's say, 10 years, it's really the time to think about those long-term volunteers and how you can continue that ladder of engagement, even beyond what you thought would be possible, engaging people as ambassadors or emeritus volunteers. Okay, before we run out of time, I do want to let you know other resources that I have available for you. First of all, I will send out a resource sheet with the recording of this webinar afterwards, which will highlight some of the key points that I made, and we'll have some links to additional resources that I find useful. In addition to that, if you are getting ready for a planning process and you're looking for ideas, I mentioned about SWOT and SMART goals and how there's all these existing resources. If this isn't something you do all the time, maybe you don't know how to get started with having a really engaging and effective meeting where you can do some planning. I have a lot of facilitation and meeting planning resources on my website, sharonspeaks.com. That will also be linked to in the follow-up email. In addition to that, I do work with people. So if you know that there's a big planning process coming on board for your organization and you'd like some expert help, there's a few different ways that I can provide that help. The first of which is if you would like to develop your own skills in leading more effective meetings, I provide meeting facilitation coaching. So I will work with whoever it is, whether it's you or someone else, who wants to lead the meetings themselves, but knows that they want to develop that, have that professional development along the way and get ideas not only for your own skills as a facilitator and leader, but also for those specific meeting design ideas that I can help offer. So that's one thing that I do for people. Another thing that I do is what I call process facilitation. This is for those big planning processes. If you are working on a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, action planning for the next year, anything where you need to somehow gain the collective wisdom of a large group, and it's a bit overwhelming, and it's no one's job, and no one has time to actually make sure that it happens and happens effectively, that's when it can be an incredibly good investment to just be able to have an outside facilitator come in, because someone like me can make sure that the meetings are actually a really good use of everyone's time, and that this doesn't drag on forever, and that the plan that you end up with doesn't just sit on the shelf. It's actually something that people are excited to implement and has clear ways to be implemented. So that's a big common thing that I work on. And then the final one would be what I would call event facilitation. This is maybe you've got an organizational retreat coming up, or you want to do team building with a new core of volunteers or your whole volunteers and staff because you want to improve those staff and volunteer relationships. Whatever that might be, I do that team building or organizational retreat planning as well. And I can either help you plan it, or I can help you plan it and I can facilitate it. So that is how you can work with me. If you are interested in any of those, just reply to the follow-up email and we can set up a time to talk more in detail, because much of that depends on the size and scope of each project in terms of how we roll that out. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And this is something that I'm very passionate about. I love to geek out about. So if you do have specific questions about anything I brought up on the phone call or the webinar today, I'd be happy if you want to follow up with me through email, phone call, whatever it is. I think I do have another comment here. So I'm going to stay on board for the remaining time. We've got about 5 minutes left. I can take any specific questions that you want me to run by, or just, even if it's a little bit tangential to the topic today, I'm happy to do my best. Tanya says, I think it did help. I'm glad to hear that. Excellent. Yeah, it is, particularly for the national service programs, that is a big challenge, and I know it's something that is hard to make enough time and resources to be able to do that really high-touch member support that makes sure that that member experience is what everyone wants it to be. And if you're not familiar, I know I've mentioned AmeriCorps multiple times today, so if you haven't been familiar with national service programs, you can go to nationalservice.gov to learn more, or